Okay.
Okay, so.
Okay. Good morning. So, do you like my owl? Jen?
Looks like someone's in the waiting room.
Okay, yell if you see more.
Okay.
So here's what's going on. Here's why I have my, look at this. This thing is called meeting owl. I don't know. I'm fascinated. I don't know about you. It actually, when you turn it on and turn it off, it makes owl sounds. So I have no idea how to use it. It's my first time. So, anybody else? The reason we're recording is for two reasons. I have several people who are sick, as you can see, and primarily, to be honest, is because this year, I'm coming for tenure. I don't know if you know about the process, how professors kind of advance. You start as an assistant professor after your PhD, and 6 years later, you apply for tenure, and you become, and if you're granted tenure, then you also become an associate professor. And then 6 years later, I think you become full professor. So this is just kind of degree. So I applied for promotion early. So last year I became an associate professor. Yip, yip, yip. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of effort that goes into it. But this year now, so tenure means that it is harder for university to say, oh, we are going to cut your program, and we will not be able to employ you. If you are on contract or adjunct, you basically kind of depend on the job. Every semester you have to kind of negotiate your job situation for the people. Right now, I'm being renewed every 2 years, and once I have tenure, I basically have a job. That's all it is. The same goes to university museums, by the way. In many museums, there's also a tenure track situation. So that is something that gives you definitely extra job security. Okay, having said that, so what that means is that we may, I don't even know, if I'm recording and then presenting them, or if we have right now Professor Bosch and Professor Boros listening to me right now. If we do, hello. If we don't, then they can listen to that. We're going to have a couple more sessions like that. It doesn't concern you at all. So, plan for the week. Questions before we go. Concerns. The recording will only go to my committee members that are co-professors. So it's not, and people, Alyssa and Leah and a couple other people. Okay. Game plan for the week. Today we're going to talk about decolonizing museums first. And then I'm going to go over what to do for your exhibition review. Hopefully, if we have time left, I'm going to give you time to work on that if time permits. Next time on Wednesday, first half of the class, we're going to work on your exhibition review. Second half of the class, I want you to continue working on your exhibition. So it's going to be more kind of workshop situation. I want to go over your text again with you, etc. Okay, so we're in class, we're doing that. Okay, decolonizing museums. That's our topic for right now at least. And that's a carryover from a couple of weeks ago. So we'll talk about that. So the idea, what does decolonizing mean, first of all? Decolonizing, it means that you kind of understand and take away that colonial legacy, or at least acknowledge that colonial legacy that is presented in a museum. So it comes from post-colonial theory, that if you've taken any of the classes, you probably, more theoretical upper level classes, you probably may have heard it, you may have even applied the method without knowing. So post-colonial theory looks at the kind of legacies of colonization and imperialism. So for example, if we look at the Aboriginal culture, First Nations culture, what are the legacies, right, of the colonization? How does colonization affect, say, Aboriginal education? It is, post-colonial theory basically is applied to most of the aspects of humanities and social sciences, literary studies, art history, anthropology, history of political thought, etc., etc. So, and even sometimes in sciences as well. So the term post-colonialism, so we're all on the same page, means ideological response to colonialist thought, right? So we are responding to the processes of colonization and traces of colonization that we see around us. And we obviously, post-colonial theory of post-colonialism represents kind of departure from colonialism, kind of radical departure, but at the same time, it came out of the kind of need to understand that nations, races, places that were colonized, you cannot really kind of say, okay, that's ended, now you got your independence, and we can carry on from here, now become whatever. There's legacy there, it's pretty obvious, right? There's legacy there of colonization that we need to take into consideration as we move forward. Acknowledge, kind of grieve, understand, etc. Does it make sense? Do you have questions? Okay. So with in the museums, I'm going to show you my two kind of favorites here. The two books that I like, Colonialism and the Object, Empire, Material Culture in the Museum. This is edited by Tim Berenger and Tom Flynn, and the whole picture, the colonial story of the art in our museums and why we need to talk about it, by Alice Crofter. So what does it mean? How do we apply post-colonialist theory to museums? Let me open it to you for a second. How do you think we can apply that?
So a lot of times when we're talking about objects in the museum, we're talking about how when you have an object, you're trying to tie it into the story of the exhibit, and we're constantly thinking about that. But with post-colonialist thought in museums, you not only have to tie it into your thesis of your exhibit, you have to tie it into the greater context of the world, and we have this idea of oh, there's so little space, but now we have to make sure, and I'm saying now, we should have been making sure that we leave room for context in everything that we do. When we're displaying graphic scenes of horrific slavery, and you need to make room and not just talk about this is who painted it. You need to say this was a part of the Atlantic slave trade. You need to make sure no matter how much you want to go on talking about particular details, you have to make room for whatever you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to make room, you have to apply and understand that what we have in our collections represents the entire community, right? We always have, trust me, we always have objects that in the collection that kind of questionable. and we don't know how to interpret them. So this is one thing. Applying post-colonial theory in a museum is making sure that we explain how these objects got to the museum and talking about it, somehow acknowledging that, which is sometimes not easy. The other thing about the kind of idea of decolonizing, so this is applying post-colonial theory, and I'm not asking you to kind of to differentiate it very clearly. I don't think that matters for what we're doing. But the idea of decolonizing is much broader than that. That's why I talk about decolonizing. Because decolonizing does not necessarily mean kind of talking about histories of the objects or groups of people that unfortunately were oppressed and maybe not acknowledged. Decolonizing your museum goes a lot more into kind of opening it up, making sure that everyone is welcome, right? Kind of understanding that systemically, museums are very much elitist institutions. Remember our reading on Carol Duncan and how museums tend to be intimidating. So how do we open it up? So then this is kind of what I'm thinking of decolonizing museums, exhibiting the systems that normally are concealed by museum display. And I will show you an example in a couple of minutes, emphasizing the narrative of, say, Black people in the history of the United States. So something that is normally would not be shown on a display, making museum more inviting and open for everyone. Deconstructing the boundaries between expert and audience, right? So we're experts. I'm teaching you to be experts. But we also have to understand that's not necessarily always great. We can also kind of make it more approachable for other people, more relatable between professional artists and amateurs in the galleries. Racial differences in between staff and the audience, etc. And in this, I'm going to let you kind of finish writing, and then I want to move and show you what I mean. So I think it's changed ever so slightly in the last few years, but I think still, when you go to a museum, especially a large one like in New York, for example, you go to the MoMA, or you go to the Met, or you go to even the, I don't know if Met relates, to be honest, but to some extent. You look at the staff, you look at curators, exhibit designers, all these people. They usually Caucasian. They're educated, it's a very, and then you look at security guards and people who work in a cafeteria, and it's a completely different picture. And in museums, it's really pronounced. And it kind of continued on for generations. So let me introduce you to someone who kind of brought social attention to that. This is Fred Wilson, and this is his installation from 1991 called The Guarded View. Guarded View. So he did it in the collection of Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. So it's a big, obviously Whitney is a large museum. So what he did is this, he himself used to work as a security guard when he was doing his undergraduate degree. He's a New Yorker from Bronx. And he says, let's look at these people. They look like mannequins, right? They look like the museum guards. And he he kind of relates his own experience, and he talks about his work, and he says, as a museum guard, you're completely invisible. People and you become almost part of the collection, if you will. You're there, people don't look at you. You are like a mannequin in the store. You become an object, not a subject. So this is kind of what he commenting on. So we can kind of look at that and think about how do we change that. One of the things, changing something like that is very much a decolonizing a museum. Okay, let me introduce you further to Fred Wilson, because he probably he's kind of started the idea of or tradition of looking at collections critically. So he's born in 1954, he's in New York, and he's a conceptual artist. Right now, I think for the most part, he has his own independent practice. He curates, he does installations, he represented America in the several different biennials in the last few years. And most recently, he actually started working with the Murano glass in black. So he's doing black glass and does installations with that. He's a museum professional, which is very important for us, and it will become important, and I'll explain in a second. And as a guard, he worked in the Newburgh Museum in New York City, so that's where his installations come from. His main contribution that I want to share with you is Mining the Museum that took place from 1992 to 1993 in Maryland, at the Maryland Historical Society. I've talked about that in other classes, so Jen, you probably, yeah. So you may be somewhat familiar. So what he did is so Fred Wilson comes out, he's a practicing artist, but he also gets a job and he works part-time as in several museums in New York and Washington, D.C. So he knows what the museum is and he understands how museums function, which is very important. So when he comes and he's hired as a kind of guest curator at the Maryland Historical Society, together with this kind of more innovative, almost curatorial think tank at the time called the Contemporary Museum. What he's asked is to go through what is on display in the Maryland Historical Society and what is in the collection of Maryland Historical Society and kind of shake it up, if you will. So shake, really kind of see what he can, how he can actually make what is invisible in the history of Maryland to become visible. So what becomes then is this idea of mining the museum. So you kind of, what mining is in terms of the kind of getting precious metals, but also mining the data. You're kind of looking for certain objects. So this is kind of a background. The title of the exhibition refers to how Wilson extracted an unearthed object from the Maryland Historical Society collections to create this exhibition. The purpose of the exhibition was to address biases museums have, often omitting or underrepresenting oppressed people or focuses on prominent white men. So we know that Wilson took the existing museum's collection and reshuffled them to highlight the history of African American and Native American Marylanders. This reassembly created a new viewpoint of colonization, slavery, and abolition through the use of satire and irony. So, how many of you have been to a historical society? Okay, we have Ellen who's working there, with the local one. So, what would be the characteristics of traditional kind of historical society? What do you think?
So our historical society is a great example of this, because they're kind of undergoing like a transition right now, where like the front half is kind of a more modern museum, like very much post-colonial thought applied, but like our back rooms, which we're trying to clean up, are still very much just shelves upon shelves of everything, with like maybe like a sentence for each one, a quick label, who donated it, and that's it.
Yeah,
It's just like a collection of things with no thought to whether or not it's worth being there or why we put it there. Well, the other part of the museum is very, very carefully thought out, considering why do we have an item, why is it significant? Does it complement the other things in the collection? And if you want to see it, come visit the Historical Society.
yes. Absolutely. So historical society is not something that represents the local history of the area. But usually the local who preserves and really thinks about donating and kind of keeping these. Usually white settlers, right? So this is kind of, and as a result of that, both the collection and especially the displays usually underscore, emphasize that particular culture. So Fred Wilson is in the business of changing that. So this is Maryland Historical Society. This is what the display looked like when he started, right? This is so very much this painting is a white people, white family with their toys, etc. And actually, if you look carefully, and I don't think I have, no, I don't have, I just couldn't find the actual, a good image of this. But if you look at the painting closely enough, in the right bottom corner, there is an African American child. And then at the kind of middle left, there's another little girl who's looking into the door, and that's an also African American child. So there are two people. Now, the original label says absolutely nothing about these kids. They identify by name every single white child. It's a group portrait. They are playing, nothing about African American kids. So Fred Wilson says that just wouldn't do. So what he did is he brought a class of the inner city children from a primary Maryland school, and he talked to them about this. And he explained that these two children, two black children, are slaves, and they are kept as almost pets or as kind of playmates for the white kids. And he asked the children, actual real children, saying, okay, now what do you think that child in the bottom, do you think he feels? He's like, what age? Probably around 7, looks like around 7. What does he feel? And they kind of started voicing that. So he recorded that, and he exhibited this painting with the recording of the voices of the children who were saying things like, he's probably worried where his mom is. He wants to go back to his house, like things like that. That kids would normally say. So this is one of this, and so his installation, mine in the museum, was essentially reinstalling everything that he found in the society. So that was one room. The other room was this, or another kind of part. So these, in the section, in the storage, in the section under cabinet making, he found all these chairs, which were not surprised, but he also found a whipping post. And it was because people didn't know how to categorize them, it ended up being under cabinet making. And it was actually a whipping post that stood between 1820 to 1960 in front of the courthouse. And it was placed for the public whipping and punishment of people. So now he arranged that, and he says, okay, well, then all these chairs and people are looking at this. So, and for us, we're looking at that, but this is not our history, but imagine if you kind of part of that community and all of a sudden, and you grew up there and you all of a sudden see that in the museum. It's very powerful. Now, this is where his museum background comes in, is not only he does that, but he also says, okay, if he added this as a panel, says these are object questions, right? So these are the questions that we ask about an object, so including the whipping post. So what is it? Where is it? Why? How? What is it saying? What can you touch? What do you hear? What do you see? All these questions about the object are important questions. And if you think about that and you ask about the chair, it's one thing, but if you ask about the whipping post, then it becomes a whole different story. I'm going to skip a few in the interest of time. So this is a very powerful one. He found the KKK hood and he put it into a grid, and that was part of them. So there's, remember how I would talk about the fact that he uses irony as well, kind of this dry wit, and that's an issue. The signs are signs of fugitive slave rewards, posters, and then this is a gun, so kind of again thinking through that. And this is often reproduced, and this is a very interesting in terms of art. I think it's a very interesting one how he created. So this is a globe, and the word that we see in there says truth. So on the right, we have actually people that we know and recognize. Those of us of Andrew Jackson, Napoleon, and Henry Clay. On the right, on the left, those are empty, right? Because museums usually don't have them. They were never produced, but those are important people from African American history. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Banneker. So representing the absence and trying to insert the narrative somehow. So this is probably one of the last ones that I'm going to show you. This is called metalwork. Those are chains of the slave. And this is the silver. So the silver this is when he found the display, obviously the silver was there. This is part of the middle class existence. And then he also found the shackles. And the shackles were grouped in the storage under metalwork. So, and they are metalwork. So he posted this. This is assortment of the objects under the metalwork. So indicating that, who would polish the silver, who would take care of the silver, but also all of this. If I think about it in terms of museology, all of that is metalwork. All of that is this particular kind of category of storage. So think how a museum or any categorization obliterates the narrative. The other thing he does, and he did it, this is actually in biennial in Istanbul. So he asked, so he came there and he talked to the curators. And he said, okay, bring me any art that shows kind of people that are darker skinned, like African Americans or just darker skinned. And they brought him some, like, I think something like 12 paintings. He looked at them, he said, is that all you have? Because it was a large central museum. So he said, yeah. So he said, do you mind if I go? So, yeah, sure. So he went through, and he found another 12 or 13, like, at least as much. He says, listen, if you don't have the eye, our eye is so predicated on looking for particular narrative again, particular people. We do not even see blackness. We're not looking for it. And if we're not looking for it, we kind of, because the curators knew their art and they knew it for particular reasons, they didn't even realize how many they had. So then what he did is he took this and he blew up kind of people with darker skin and put them around so people actually could see the narrative. What do you think? What do you think about the strategies? Pretty interesting, right? So, the reason I'm showing that to you is because this is like, that was groundbreaking. And since then, I mean, a lot of people and a lot of institutions that went that route, the issue of restitution, right, repatriation of the objects also came out of that. Also came out of kind of going back and seeing, what does my collection tell about our institution? What is the history here? Okay, before we continue, questions, comments?
Yeah, I did think that was really awesome what he was doing, and I do think it is like switching the narrative to some degree, or like exposing alternative narratives that are within the work, or the ones that you're ignoring, so I just think that's very inspiring.
Yes, it is, yeah.
I think it's cool because even with the paintings, it's still like the white narrative.
Yeah.
But you can totally ignore what he's doing if you don't pay attention to it. So it shows like he's putting it right in your face, but it's so you can still ignore it just as easy. I think it's just like good commentary, you know.
Yeah, I think. I think in some cases it's harder to ignore than in others, but I think it's really interesting to have both.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that he didn't just like throw these together randomly, like it was based on things in the museum, like all the cabinet making had that whipping post, like he's playing off of that too. Like, why is this categorized like this? Not just putting these exhibits together and being like, look, like he's actually going off of things that are happening in museums, which I think makes it even more powerful.
Yes, yeah, so what happened in the museum, and when he, I was watching the interview with him about that, and said, I don't think I would have done it if I didn't know how museums work. As an artist, it would be much harder, because I could kind of talk to people who work there in their language and use it and kind of also explain and neutralize, because if you go with just a lot of passion into something like that, at that time especially, it would be harder. Okay.
It made me think that maybe they should have a position inside museums where they hire like a person of color, and that's their sole position of job is to find these things to change the narrative. Yeah, and it's I wish we could. It's not always practical, but yeah, absolutely. Sometimes what happens more and more, to be honest, is museums or historical societies would hire someone part-time, like a contractor, to kind of go through the collection and actually make sense of what curator doesn't know, or kind of unearth these other narratives and kind of bring them up. And that really, Fred Wilson played an important part in that, yeah.
This kind of feels like he is speaking more to the curators than like an actual audience, like Well, he is speaking to the audience, but it sounds like this is a pretty strong message to curators.
To museums,
Yeah,
yes,
to be
yes,
like-
absolutely,
which-
yeah.
Yeah, that's something that's just clicking now.
Yes, yeah, and that's, I think that's why it's kind of, there is a message there that has many layers and appeals to different people. So, which is always good for an artwork. Okay, moving on. Let me introduce you to a person who is honestly, very, very different. She is a museum educator, writer, curator, Nina Simon. I have a part of her book that I posted on Canvas, asked you to read. So let me just kind of explain to you who she is and how she came to it. She's a huge advocate of participatory interactive museum. Bless you. She worked at the museum, I think it was Museum of Art in San Diego, Santa Cruz, and she was their educator, and then she was the director of that museum. And she decided that she wants to talk and she wants to publish, and she became more of a public speaker / consultant, consultant, that now deals with issues of participation. So she ran this, I think she doesn't do it anymore, but there's a museum2blogpost.com. If you want to kind of just, it's not academic read in no way, shape, or form. One thing about Nina Simone that I really like is that she does not write academically at all. She is like, I don't even know how to explain. Like she's like just it's a everyday language. This is what we're doing. This is what we need to do. This is how we do it. She's not an academic. So as a result of that, she's a lot more approachable. She's very, very practical in the sense she's very inspiring. She chose to publish her books with like basically they're either self-published or they're published with like a very independent little press because she didn't want to go to peer review presses or anything like that. She wanted to write it the way she talks. And that's what you will get in the blog post, so you can read that. So, okay, so her idea is that museums should be essentially activity hubs. So she privileges education. They should be spaces for conversations, meeting place where one would encounter people that one would never meet in different circumstances. Places that exhibit objects that spark the conversation. Kind of places where people contribute things meaningful. And places of interactive play. Among other things. So she's an activist, so she believes in this very strongly. And she essentially says nobody benefits from just having objects that nobody cares on display. Nobody benefits from having this wonderful old art on display if we don't bring in visitors. And we definitely need that to survive economically, financially. So, let me show you. Yeah, this is a project that she did as a consultant, as part of her consulting practice with Washington, D.C. So, Building Museum in Washington, D.C. wanted to run something that would involve community. And a lot of in community involvement, especially kind of like, you ask people to contribute, like guest book or draw a picture at the end. Some of these are meaningful and some of these are really not. People just say something like, oh, it was good, it was nice, you know, and etc. So she actually decided to change things. So what she did is this. It was a summer program where they recruited children, inner city children, from teenagers from high school. And they would get, as at the end of that, they would have a really nifty digital camera. This was a few years ago, but not everyone had like these amazing phones necessarily. So they would get out of that a digital camera that they can keep, and community participation credit, so kind of like a volunteer credit that they need. And then they would be taught to photograph cityscape, urban environment, and then they would go and photograph kind of the city that they live, their surroundings. They would be taught how to crop, you know, how to do all the image processing, and then they would be responsible for installing their own exhibition with the help of curators. So this is what you see. So as a result of that, it's a lot of work. But what it did is obviously it opens the museum for participation. Not only these teenagers, but do you think their friends came to see their work? Do you think their parents came to see their work? You know, it really is opening up the museum to communities and to groups that normally find it a little bit overwhelming, or like they don't know it, not necessarily they go there. So Nina Simone is talking about museum that way, as a kind of idea of decolonizing museum, opening it up completely and totally to museum, and she talks about idea of how do you to interpret the artifact. And she says that people sometimes use pets or children as a conversation starter. So you walk your dog, the person comes to you, talks to kind of uses your dog, but then you end up having a conversation. So like, I want the objects to become dogs. I want the objects to be part of that kind of conversation. And she gives some ideas on how, if you really make displays that deal with things that people are interested in, like finances, money, poverty, but not in a prescriptive kind of preachy way, but actually kind of asking people to think about it, that really works. So this is what she does. So in terms of that project that I told you about, with their students, teenagers, the institution provided framework, space, session, instruction, and the teenagers provided content, design, and implementation. So imagine what a valuable program that is for someone who's in high school. So Nina Simone, in terms of kind of more, kind of theoretical basis, she kind of talks about two types of collaborative projects. One involves consultations, so you bring community members, and they provide guidance as you develop your exhibition. Right, so institutions engage experts or community representatives to provide advice, guidance to staff members as they develop new exhibitions, programs, publications. So if you're developing a project about Aboriginal culture, you bring members of that particular group to make sure you run all your materials by them. You hopefully pay them to do that, and that's kind of what you would do. But they are external, they're external to the project. And then there are also co-development projects, like the project that I just talked about with the school, high school students, in which staff members work together with participants to produce new exhibitions and programs. So Nina Simone talks about these two as a kind of almost base, a platform for where you want to do, what you want to do, if you want to even start kind of decolonizing the museum. All right, okay, so questions, comments on that? I'm going to kind of skip that. We'll kind of cover that anyway, so we'll move to exhibition review. So before we do that, take a minute to kind of to rest and think about your questions, pull out your exhibition review yourselves, etc. Okay, so exhibition review. Due on Wednesday, I believe. So I'm asking for 1,200 words, which is about 5 double-spaced pages. So kind of if you're inserting images in there, just to keep that in mind. Include a link to the exhibition for me, please. Images are optional, link should be there so I can actually go see what you saw. So what I thought I would do is fairly quickly, I'm going to show you an exhibition. I'm going to show you a very quick video here on the exhibition that I've seen a few years ago. It's kind of was absolutely awesome. And I'm going to go over the questions that you have that I've asked you and kind of model for you what I would do. Yeah, okay. So the exhibition that I saw was first one, was Icons of Modern Art, the shipping collection.
Friends would walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?" And I would just tell them, "It's mud."
Exactly what we want to know right now. Not even.
Ça fait très très longtemps que nous rêvions de faire une exposition Tchoukine, de voir la collection Tchoukine tout simplement, puisqu'elle est divisée depuis 1948 entre 2 ensembles, au musée d'Ermitage et au musée Пушкин.
Сергея Ивановича Щукина. И личность эта необыкновенная, и та коллекция, которую он создал, она тоже необыкновенна.
Ce projet, si on doit en faire l'histoire rapidement, une initiative de la famille qui demandait et qui demande que la mémoire de Tchoukine soit honorée, et on est tous absolument ravis de pouvoir le faire, un intérêt, une ouverture des grands musées russes à une pratique de prêt massif. À ma connaissance, mes confrères des musées n'ont jamais vu les collections réunies eux-mêmes.
Il y a 65 œuvres du musée de Pouchkine et il y a 65 œuvres de l'Ermitage. C'est une exposition sans précédent et il n'y aura plus jamais une exposition pareille. Jamais aucun musée russe n'a prêté autant de chefs-d'œuvre en même temps.
Et donc on va revoir pour la première fois, renaît la collection Tchoukine. C'est un moment effectivement fort.
Le rôle de Marina Lechac, la nouvelle directrice du musée Pouchkine, a été aussi de suggérer et de souhaiter que l'exposition se développe du côté des avant-gardes russes. La dernière salle de l'exposition, qui présente à la fois Mardi Gras de Cézanne, Picasso, La nature morte au bol vert et flacon noir, qui est une icône, La femme au râteau de Malevitch, mais aussi Le carré noir, etc., se termine sur une sorte de travée de lumière qui fait que notre œil se lève vers le skylight torse de Guéry et l'intervention de Buren. C'est la dernière image de l'exposition. Elle permet de comprendre que ces artistes, architectes ou plasticiens, sont les enfants de Cézanne, Picasso et Malevitch. Cette exposition dans ce bâtiment, elle a un sens particulier aujourd'hui.
Way too much happening on my screen. Okay, so the exhibition is, so let me kind of give you a bit of a background story. So it's an exhibition called the Icons of Modern Art. It's an exhibition that was brought to Paris of the Russian collector. His name is Sergei Shukin Collection. This is the name of the exhibition. And it was never exhibited together as well. Maybe. Okay, so the first time that collection was exhibited together as a collection since it was broken apart. So Shukin lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Moscow. He was after the, I give up, you know, like seriously, I give up. Okay, that's what I'm doing. I'm not changing. Right, like that. Okay, so 1917, Bolshevik Revolution. He's given his work to the government. He does not. He didn't want to even keep them for himself. He's a merchant. Used to be a merchant, kind of like Carnegie. If you were to, or Rockefeller, that's the kind of the scope of his work. Similarly he invested in the textile trade and railroads. Well, the similarities in the railroads there to the Gilded Age. So, and he collected, and he was mainly known for his collections of Impressionists and also Matisse's work. So this is kind of a restored photograph, kind of colored in photograph of how one of the rooms in his palace used to look like. So you can see how many he heavily collected Monet, he heavily collected Matisse, and again and others. So 1917, he gives his collection to the state. The state exhibits that for a while as one collection, then it mixes it up, and then it breaks it. It breaks it equally and completely randomly. 65 works go to one museum in Moscow, and 65 go to Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So they're in two different places. And the collection was never brought together until just before it traveled to Paris. So it's a big deal. Now, the other big deal is the fact that these works almost never leave Russia, because whenever they come and leave Russia and come to the West, someone from Shukin had several children, so someone from his family start suing to keep the collection here, to keep at least some of the works here. They present their rights. Because, so the argument goes that while, it's one of those things where, yes, he gave it to the state, but did he have a choice not to give it to the state? So the proponents say, listen, he always wanted it to be a museum, because he did have his palace open as a museum space, but so there's that kind of controversy going on. So before this exhibition was brought to this amazing space, that's the foundation of Louis Vuitton, built in 2014 by Frank Gehry. So before it was brought in, there were five years of preparation. And one of the things was that every single member of Shukin's family living abroad was actually asked to sign a paper that they will not sue and they will not claim the rights for any of the works. And I don't think it held. I think there are still a couple of things still in court right now. So these things don't necessarily hold. So that's the premise of the exhibition. Obviously, it's a big blockbuster show where you get a lot of people. It made news, etc. So here are the questions that I'm asking you, and kind of we're talking about, right? So I'm asking myself, what's the story? What story is the curator trying to tell? So to me, in this case, it's not only story about development of the modern art, it's much more story of the collector. And that is very important. So this is where I would definitely, and it was very interesting because these two were kind of going simultaneously in the collection, in the exhibition, with at the same time this very, very little text as well. So that was kind of interesting. So what do you think is the purpose or goal of the exhibition? And then I think the goal is really was to show that collection. But there are also other things that I think came into. So the Foundation Louis Vuitton with this exhibition really puts itself at this on the level that of the Louvre, for example, or something like it's really prestigious thing to do, and obviously that is something that's a foundation that has a lot of money. So they I don't think they necessarily, to be honest, compete with Louvre. They more compete with something like Guggenheim in Bilbao. So those large collections that have roots in collecting throughout the 20th century, which Louis Vuitton has only to an extent. What is museum? This is kind of goes into what is museum trying to accomplish with it. So kind of really, it's a huge feather in their cap, right? And it's very important. So another thing I did is, because I could I looked up Ann Baldessari, she's the chief curator. And she's a well-published author in modern art. She worked previously as a chief curator director in Museum Picasso. And then, of course, you know, the wonderful thing that is internet also told me that she was ousted, she was fired because the expansion of the Museum Picasso was too expensive, took too long. And the staff was very much complaining that she had very brutal ways of management, like she seems to be a very strong personality. So, does it relate? No. The fact that she works with Museum Picasso does. Also, one of the things that I kind of found is that one of the people who really opposed her, the fact that she was fired was one of the, not like the kind of the relatives of Picasso. So it showed me that she's very well connected and she's part of that kind of avant-garde heritage wall, definitely. Okay, so then there are Matisses that I'm going to look at, I'll show you a bit further. So I think the goal is to bring all the paintings together, see the collection as it was. The museum is demonstrating the power of the foundation. So next set of questions is how has the curator organized the exhibit to accomplish the purpose, right? So what did they do? How is the museum exhibition organized? So the logic, that's why I wanted you to be there, to go and visit the exhibition, to see how it feels. So in this case, this is one just kind of display area here that I have. This is another one. This is the traditional. This is what the paintings were looked like in his house. And this was called Matisse room. So you can see how it's not quite the the salon came where works are very, very close by. It's not quite, but it's definitely not the museum style. So then I started looking at this. This is how it was presented in the foundation. So we can see that they completely did not take into consideration how Shukin himself exhibited his art. They went for this kind of modernist white cube style of display. And so then I have to kind of think about that. Like, what does it mean? How does it feel? How does that affect the collection and his intentions? The other thing that I noticed when I was there, and it's a very big exhibition, so you have to walk a lot. But then also when I was kind of going through the photographs, I realized, look at how people, very few people actually look like they look at art here. A lot of people look at everything else, like books, phones, etc. Which kind of made me, it's something that I would wonder if I wrote. One of the things, again, that I noticed from the exhibition is that there was no text. There was just the kind of the label, barely any text. There was a text that as you enter, it tells you a little bit about the inter panel. And as you go from space to space, it gives you a little bit. But really, in order to really learn and know, you have to either watch a video or kind of buy or get a guide or the catalog. So these are kind of things that I would ask myself, like how effective is it, etc. So the other things that I kind of looked at what accompanied the exhibition. So the display is traditional white cube, minimal text, but then there's also the commissioned film made by famous director Peter Greenaway, and that was kind of interpreting a collection. There were several performances kind of during while people were looking, there were also dance performances. And one of the things, and I don't know, I don't have it here, one of the things that sometimes would happen is the light would change as I was, so certain, sometimes it would be very lit up, like I had here, and then the light would kind of go down, and only the images would remain lit up. And, it kind of fluctuated, so there was this, a little interactive aspect, which kind of was neat and interesting. So these kind of take into consideration. So what is the critical, and then from there I can go into the critical assessment of the exhibition. Did the curator tell the story? Well, to an extent, but not quite. If we wanted to look at kind of the idea of the Shukin collection together, it was very much the reading of the curator and her grouping, and had nothing to do with how he grouped his work. Et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not asking you in your review to answer every single question that I have here, right? So you're kind of picking and choosing. What are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, you can talk about that, et cetera. Anything that you kind of was not interested in. This is important here. So the biases, right? This is, I want you to look critically, you look at the exhibition, what are you trying to get out of it? What does it not tell? What are the hidden narratives that you don't see? What does it privilege? And what does it omit? What is missing from here? What is the interpretation kind of in this basically summary? What does it tell about culture? In this case, the exhibition that I've seen, it essentially very much, it doesn't challenge our cultural norms, right? It completely just kind of celebrates the same people that we already kind of very much enamored by the society. Is that a good or bad? I don't know. It's just the nature of exhibition, but it's important to understand that there are no new names there, basically, to look at. Questions, comments? Okay, so we've got what, a few minutes. Look at your exhibitions, start kind of thinking through what you want to do. I'm just going to go around, see where you're at, okay? So raise your hand if you have questions for me. Of course. Oh, okay. Okay, good. Yeah, when I work here, I'm trying to- Okay, yeah. How big is that?
It's kind of a small.
Okay. Do you have an out? Do you think you have an out?
I think so.
Awesome.
Oh, I did it already.
Oh, okay. That's good.
I did like a small one for an exhibition at the quarantine class.
Okay. What is it about?
It's higher design, and it's about like the history of wine and glassware. And it like has a section on Taylor's wine two small cabinets that are being. And then there is a bunch of text. And that's just gonna be for us, so it's like. It's like, if I'm in there, it's expecting one more, but from those who are here, so I would open the screen.
Is it like a promotional episode?
It was sponsored by one.
Oh, who did not give them anything to show?
Well, like all the objects were donated by the line. So I was like, if they didn't donate any of the objects, would be like this even happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was like, they had like probably like only 9 of them, only 9 objects in the items.
Is it like this object should be applied to fingerling line painting?
It was,
Okay.
so what it was like a history of like one was.
Oh.
It was like they had that,
Mhm.
and they had those businesses. Story, range, glass, and these 2 cabinets were like 3 sessions. Where our characters were still in the glass.
Mhm.
And you walk in and it's just those 2, and they're kind of this. Other things are like, they're very modern. Probably in 1600s. And then so in the 1950s, people started wine and fingerprints. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting, okay. Yeah. That's some problems.
It was funny with it, they really just closed up.
Okay.
It was great.
Mhm.
Wasn't as.
Right, okay, yeah. Mhm.
It's really interesting how we now it has us to discuss the autism and everything. And how it was just like, when it wasn't necessarily a story. And how, the judges picked the works that stood out necessarily for the theme, and it was more, decided they don't want to present in their submissions. Right.
So it's at the map with the finger lakes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay. No, okay. So do you think there's a kind of an anonymous story?
I think that was like, it's man, every 2 years.
Yeah, right.
And I was gonna talk about that and how the representation was different. And go into, there was like an issue of pieces being, they were in class, and they talked, it was really cultural, so it's coming around and how they were seeing face the limited, exhibition text. So
Sure, yeah, I don't know, it's hard because it doesn't have like a kind of the premise, almost like a territorial theme. So it's going to be, I think it's a little bit, it's different than what is more difficult, but yeah.
yeah, which was being my problem is that it's supposed to have.
Yeah.
So it's going on.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, I'm doing beyond and go exhibition.
Okay, yes. Okay. Okay. So you remember how it felt? Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, to videos and pictures, okay. All right, okay, so we're gonna finish for today. If you have questions, let me know. So on Wednesday, if you're done, some people are, or almost, then that's great. You can work on other things. And if you're not, then you can talk a little bit about your reviews. Okay?
You're all finished. Thanks.